What's the most stupid thing you've seen a grown adult get angry over? One time we went to the bookstore Borders with my family. While we were there, my mom noticed a toy car that my little brother really liked. The toy had a small door that was part of its packaging, and my mom accidentally broke it. After that, she asked the cashier if she could get a discount on the toy since it was damaged. The cashier explained that she wasn't able to offer discounts on damaged items. My mom didn't take this well. She became very upset and used hurtful language towards the cashier, then left the store in a hurry. This incident is just one example of the kind of behavior I had to deal with from my mom. These types of situations were quite common, and they've made it difficult for me to maintain a relationship with her. Another example involves a summer when we were visiting our dad, who lived far away because my parents were divorced. My siblings and I decided that we wanted to stay with our dad permanently. We told her mom about our wish, hoping she would understand her feelings. Instead, she became very angry, called us ungrateful, and grounded us. To make matters worse, she took away our phone so we can talk to our dad. These experiences have been really hard to handle, and they've contributed to the current distance between my mom and me. The classic discount negotiation meltdown. That's next level parenting right there. Story 2. I work as a barista at a coffee shop. One day a customer came in and asked for a filter coffee with almond milk, and he requested that the drink be exactly 47 degrees. I made the coffee according to his specifications. A few moments later, he became very upset and complained that the drink wasn't right. I asked him to explain what the issue was, and he shouted at me, saying the drink was 1 millimeter too high. I was taken aback by this. He then started using hurtful language, questioning whether only inexperienced people worked at our coffee shop. He mentioned that he had never had this problem before and felt insulted. Despite my attempts to calm him down, he insisted that I get the manager. My manager came over, assessed the situation, and decided to ban the customer from the store to prevent any further issues. That's a quality manager right there. Story 3. My grandma has 2-type diabetes. After Hurricane Harvey destroyed her trailer, she stayed with my family for a while. During her stay, my stepdad, who also has type 2 diabetes, was preparing healthy meals for everyone. Grandma was not pleased because she preferred her usual favorites like fries, pizza, hamburgers, and pasta. My stepdad, being aware of her health, decided not to support her less healthy eating habits. He felt it was important not to enable choices that could worsen her health. Since Grandma is 59 years old, we felt it was important to prioritize her well-being and not just let her indulge in unhealthy foods. We told her that while we would provide healthy meals, she was welcome to buy and prepare any food she wanted on her own. We just didn't want to be responsible for contributing to her declining health. Story 4. One time I had an unusual experience with a police officer. I was driving around a corner and came upon what turned out to be an unmarked police car stopped in the middle of the road. The car didn't have its lights or hazard signals on, and the officer was chatting with another driver through their open windows. This kind of situation isn't too unusual in rural areas, but I knew they might not see me. To make sure I was noticed, I slowed down, drove carefully along the shoulder, and gave a brief tap on my horn, which is a standard way to let others know you're passing. In the past, this had always been met with a friendly wave of acknowledgement. This time, however, I was pulled over by the officer. He gave me a lecture on etiquette and issued a ticket for speeding, which I wasn't, and improper use of my horn. The situation eventually resolved in my favor. It turned out that my use of the horn was actually in line with local law, which describes it as appropriate in such situations. During the court hearing, the judge did not accept the speeding claim, especially since the officer admitted to being engaged in conversation at the time, and my attorney questioned how he could have observed me speeding. Story 5. My friends and I visited New York City in early December to enjoy the holiday festivities, including a trip to FAO Schwarz. Because it was so busy, we had to wait in the long line that wrapped around the block. The wait was about 50 minutes, and we passed the time chatting with others in line. While I was talking to my friends, I noticed 2 women had suddenly appeared ahead of us, as if they had inserted themselves in line. When a man with a stroller tried to push past me, I stepped in front to block him. I explained that the line was down the block and there was a long wait, but he simply responded, "Thanks for the information, but I'm trying to join my group," pointing to the women who had inserted in. The people ahead of us, who had been chatting with us, noticed the commotion and began confronting the women who had inserted themselves in line. The man grew very frustrated as he tried to get past me, but eventually the line managed to get the line inserters to leave. As they were leaving, the man turned back and expressed his frustration with some harsh words about my character. Despite his anger, I felt that standing up for the fairness of the line was the right thing to do. I didn't let his comments bother me. Story 6. I flew through Gatwick last year during the World Cup. A big mistake. The customs line was so long when you got off the plane and got through the metal doors that take you towards the large customs hall. Instead of walking towards customs, you walked the other direction, around the corner and around a post because that's where the line ended. This girl ended up behind me, and not only did she feel the need to stand so close behind me, brushing my backpack every so often, she kept coming up to stand next to me. As the line finally got into the actual customs area, there were places for people to grab custom cards to fill out and get back in their spot. Well, she went to grab one, and then jumped about 7 places in front of me. At that time, with that amount of people in the room, I just didn't care. But the lines ahead were switchback style, so every now and then I'd end up directly beside her, separated by the rope. I made sure to give her the most condescending look I could. Probably didn't do much, but I'm sure she felt at least somewhat feeling inwardly embarrassed. Whole customs line was about 2 hours. Story 7. My mom shared a story about a casino event where patrons were waiting in line for a lucky drawing. While she was in line, she noticed a woman who repeatedly tried to insert in front of others, pretending not to understand when people confronted her. This line inserted was particularly frustrating because everyone in line had a chance to win a prize, so inserting meant someone might miss out. Initially, when people asked her to move to the back, she pretended not to understand with broken English. Despite this, security was called and sent her to the end of the line. However, she kept finding ways to move back up. Eventually, security decided to remove her from the line. When she was told to leave, her demeanor changed dramatically. Her previously broken English gave way to a more fluent and hostile tone, and she began to argue loudly with a very imposing security guard. My mom said it was all she could do to keep from laughing as the tiny woman confronted the large guard with intense complaints. In the end, the line inserter was banned from the casino, and everything returned to normal, allowing everyone to enjoy their time at the casino. Story 8. A friend of mine had a serious accident at a ski park. He was coming down a 50-plus foot jump when he had to avoid a girl who was standing in a blind spot at the landing area. My friend suffered injuries. As he lay on the ground, the girl's father came over and angrily yelled at him, accusing him of almost taking his daughter's life. The situation was particularly frustrating because the area was meant for professional skiers and was surrounded by fences. Somehow, the father and his daughter had managed to bypass these barriers and end up in a threatening spot. The park staff and other skiers quickly gathered around the father, advising him that it was unsafe to let his daughter be in such a location and that they shouldn't be teaching her to ski in such unsafe areas. They then escorted him and his daughter off the mountain. This situation was made worse by the fact that my friend was injured while trying to avoid the child. The father's actions not only endangered his daughter but also contributed to my friend's injury. Despite this, he chose to blame the injured skier rather than addressing the perilous situation he had created. The worst part? He didn't learn his lesson and blames everyone. Story 9. A few years ago, I was on a flight to Florida when the oxygen masks suddenly deployed. Fortunately, we didn't need to use them, but the captain informed us there was a problem with the cabin pressure and we would be descending to a safer altitude. He advised us to expect some turbulence during the descent. During this time, a man in the row in front of me, who had a rat tail hairstyle reminiscent of the early 90s, reacted very loudly. When the announcement was made, he shouted, "Oh, come on!" I had been distracted by his unusual hairstyle for most of the flight, but the situation quickly took a more serious turn. Shortly after, the captain announced that we would be landing at the nearest major airport to switch planes. The man, who was evidently very frustrated, began loudly complaining to the point where 2 flight attendants had to come over to address him. In the next few minutes, the entire plane learned his personal story. His wife had cheated on him and he was heading to Tampa to meet a woman he had met on a dating website. He was upset because he believed his new acquaintance was already annoyed at having to pick him up from the airport and that the delay caused by switching planes would mean she might run out of gas. Despite the flight attendant's efforts to explain that it was crucial to land quickly due to a potential leak and that switching planes would be quick, he continued to rant. He even suggested that the pilot might just need to use the bathroom and that there was probably no real problem. His outburst became so disruptive that it put the flight attendant's safety to danger. They were repeatedly told by the pilot to take their seats for landing, but the man's behavior continued to be a concern. Eventually, one of the flight attendants warned him that if he didn't calm down, he might not be allowed to board the new plane in Florida. Fortunately, he did quiet down before landing. As we arrived at the gate, he remained in the plane while the rest of us disembarked. I later saw 2 airport and state police officers being escorted onto the jet bridge. Although I didn't see him depart, it was satisfying to know that his disruptive behavior likely meant he wouldn't be continuing on to Florida. It was astonishing to see someone so unable to grasp the seriousness of the situation and believe that making a scene could change the circumstances. His actions not only endangered the flight attendants, but also added unnecessary stress to an already tense situation. Story 10. While working in customer service at a grocery store, a woman came in with several boxes of canned goods and cereal. She had no receipt and claimed she had bought the items for a donation but had forgone. I scanned the items for a return and found they weren't in our system. Upon checking the expiration dates, I saw that the canned goods were from 2005 and the cereal boxes were from 2007. I explained to her that we couldn't process the return due to the items being expired and not scanning in our system. The woman reacted angrily. Shouting about poor customer service and drawing attention from other customers, my manager came over and the woman demanded a return. My manager examined the items and told her that it wasn't possible to return expired goods, even though he had instructed me to proceed. Despite the explanation, she continued to yell and eventually left the items in the counter before storming out. It was puzzling to me that someone would think they could return such old and expired products, and her reaction was quite suspicious given the situation. Story 11. One day at the coffee shop where I work, we were running a charity driven to support the local hospital. The way it worked was that customers could buy a cookie for $1 with all proceedings going to the hospital. It was a win-win situation since you got a treat while supporting a good cause. A regular customer, an old man, became quite agitated when asked to participate in the charity drive. He was accompanied by a younger man who seemed very embarrassed by the situation and apologized for the older man's behavior. The older man reacted poorly and, despite being a regular customer, he hasn't been back in the 4 months since. It wasn't just a donation with no return, you actually received a cookie in exchange for your contribution. The older man was a regular, while the younger man was only occasionally seen in the shop. Living in Canada with universal healthcare doesn't mean hospitals are underfunded. In our town, which is near a busy highway intersection, many serious injuries require transfers to other facilities due to lack of resources. I understand social anxiety can make such situations uncomfortable, and I empathize with those who find it hard to participate in these drives. We only ask regular customers once for these kinds of promotions, knowing they're familiar with their usual routine. It's surprising to see someone react so strongly over a cookie for charity. In a separate incident on Christmas Eve, our busiest day of the year, we had a particularly difficult customer situation. The store was packed, with lines extending out the door and the drive-thru wrapped around the building. It was at the front counter, dealing with a customer who was very particular about being wished a Merry Christmas. However, the real trouble began when another customer, who appeared scruffy and disheveled, but was clearly not homeless, started causing commotion. He began by loudly wishing everyone a Merry Christmas, which at first wasn't disruptive, but as he waited for his order, he became increasingly agitated. Despite waiting only about 5 minutes, he started yelling at the staff, demanding to know why they weren't smiling and using harsh language and insulting remarks. His outburst included every kind of severe criticism you could imagine and culminated in him scolding a staff member who was already struggling to keep up with the orders. The situation got so bad that the staff member was brought to tears. Our manager had to step in to handle the situation and take over cooking duties while the distressed employee took a break. The disruptive customer was banned from the store and asked to leave. Thankfully, we managed to avoid involving the police. The rest of the customers ignored the incident, which was disheartening given how he treated our staff. It was a tough day, and it was hard to believe that someone could react so poorly, especially during the holiday season. Story 12. I work answering 911 calls. One day we had a worst car accident on a main road, requiring us to reroute traffic down a side road and then back to the main road once the situation was under control. A woman living on the side of the road called in, complaining about the commercial traffic going through a residential area. I explained that the detour was necessary due to the serious accident, and that it would be removed once the situation was resolved. She was very upset, expressing frustration about the dust and pebbles being brought up by the trucks and demanded that we send someone to clean her driveway. I informed her that we couldn't assist with that request. She insisted on speaking to a supervisor. I took down her information and informed her that a supervisor would come to speak with her in person after finishing the difficult task of notifying the family of the person who passed away about the accident. I then ended the call. When the sergeant arrived at her home, she refused to answer the door or the phone when we tried to call her back. It was clear she did not want to engage further at that point. Probably because they know they get yelled at for misuse of the 911 system. Story 13. A few years ago, I worked at a pop-up Halloween store. One day, a woman sent her 2 young children into the store with their debit card so they could buy whatever they wanted. However, the son quickly realized he couldn't find the card and called his mother for help. The mother arrived at the store in a hysterical, screaming loudly that I must have stolen the card. At the time, I was both the floor supervisor and the cashier, and I assured her that I hadn't moved from my register for over half an hour. I pointed out that there were security cameras covering the register area, and I offered to help her search for the card. Despite my explanation, she didn't believe me and decided to call the cops, accusing me of theft. This meant that, as an accusation of employee theft was involved, all employees were not allowed to leave the building while we waited for the cops to arrive. It was already past closing time, and everyone was tired and eager to go home. The woman stood directly in front of the store doors, glaring through the glass with visible anger. When a police officer finally arrived, she seemed quite frustrated by the situation. She reviewed the CCTV footage, took statements from all the employees and advised the woman to deactivate her card and visit her bank the next day. After addressing the situation, the officer hung around for a few minutes, chatting with us and lightening the mood. Just as the officer was wrapping up her paperwork, her phone rang. It was the woman calling to say she had found her debit card. It was on her kitchen table, and she had simply forgotten to give it to her son. Despite her mistake, she never apologized for her actions. Damn, she deserves at least a night in jail. Story 14. I used to work at a now defunct video rental store, which had very specific procedures for processing returns. I worked there during its peak, when it had over 2,500 locations. One day, a family of 3, mom, dad, and their teenage son, came to the store. I was the shift manager and had to inform them they had an overdue videotape, which was accumulating late fees until it was returned. Despite my calm and polite explanation, the family started hurling insults at me, questioning my job choice and calling me worthless. I stood firm and politely suggested they check at home again. They demanded that I search through every single tape in the store to find theirs, but I explained that if the missing tape was located during a next inventory, we would certainly credit them and apologize. I was confident we didn't have the tape. After they left, about an hour later, I noticed the father returning to the store. He entered through the exit door, placed the missing videotape on the counter without saying a word, and then turned and walked out. I could have said something, but instead I chose to give him a look of quiet satisfaction. I felt a sense of relief, having endured their insult only to see them return the tape in silence. Story 15. I was at the post office just before Christmas, and as expected, there was a long queue. I was just 2 people away from the counter when a man came in, saw the line and joined it with a lot of visible frustration. After a couple of minutes, he announced, "I'm in a real hurry. Does anyone mind if I go to the front of the queue?" Before anyone could respond, he tried to push his way to the front. I was irritated, so I said, "Hang on a minute. I'm in a hurry too and have been waiting here for 10 minutes. You can't insert in front of me." He rolled his eyes and tried to move behind me, but then the person behind me said, "I'm in a hurry too. You can't just go in front of me." This continued with everyone in the queue stating they were also in a hurry and wouldn't let him insert. Eventually, he ended back at the end of the line. Looking furious, he stood there for a moment before loudly declaring, "Forget it. I'll come back later. Thanks a lot for being so unhelpful," and stormed out. Story 16. I was at the checkout once with a half-full trolley with a woman with an overflowing cart just pushed in front of me. I don't usually tolerate the kind of behavior, so I pushed her trolley aside and asked, "What do you think you're doing?" She turned around angrily and said she'd asked the guy in front of me if she could go behind him, and he'd said yes. I told her that wasn't how we worked and that he was wrong for letting her insert in. I made sure the guy could hear me. As I got to the register, she was still insisting she should be next. So I looked at her and then at the checkout person, saying, "If you start putting your groceries on the belt, I'm going to throw them out the door and tip over your trolley." She then walked to the back of the line. I still get upset thinking about it because no one else in line backed me up, even though she was inserting in front of them too. People nowadays are just so scared of confrontation, honestly. Anyways, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 17. Parking lots have some unwritten rules that most people follow without much thought. Generally, when you drive into a parking lot, you slowly move through the rows while searching for an open parking spot. You keep an eye out for pedestrians, hoping they're walking to the car that is about to leave. It's also important to watch out for those pedestrians and avoid any accidents, though it might not always seem like the top priority. If there are other cars ahead of you, they usually have the right of way, and it's polite not to block the traffic behind you for longer than necessary. I learned about these rules the hard way one day. I was driving through a busy parking lot near a large shopping center, looking for a spot close to the restaurant where I planned to eat lunch. Since it was lunchtime, finding a parking spot took longer than I expected, and I had to drive around the lot a few times before I found an open space. When I finally saw a spot, I drove into it, parked my car, and got out, ready to head into the restaurant and enjoy my meal. As soon as I closed my car door, I heard a voice calling out to me. I turned around and saw a woman in her 40s, driving a black SUV, looking very annoyed. She asked, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" I looked around thinking she might be speaking to someone else, but there was no one else nearby. I said, "What, me? I'm just going to get lunch." The woman responded, "I thought you were leaving." I apologized and explained, "Oh, sorry, no, I just arrived." I started walking toward the restaurant, but the woman called out again. "You don't understand," she yelled. "I thought you were leaving, okay? I thought you were leaving." I shook my head and said, "Well, I'm not." The woman's voice became more frustrated as she said, "No, listen to me. I thought you were leaving. Do you understand me?" Honestly, I was confused and didn't fully understand her frustration. I apologized once more, mentioned that I was in a hurry, and continued walking toward the restaurant. I heard her shout, "You're being very rude." She drove away, but I didn't want to get caught up in a pointless argument. From what I could remember, the woman had hoped to get my parking spot and was upset when I parked there instead. It seemed she had assumed I was leaving and was displeased when her expectation didn't match the reality. Given that I was hungry and eager to eat, I wasn't in the mood for more conflict. Story 18. A while back, I had a roommate who was really upset when I asked him to contribute to our household petty cash fund. This fund was meant for buying things like dish soap and toilet paper, just a couple of bucks a month to cover essentials that we all use. He refused to contribute, and we all agreed he would need to handle these supplies on his own. A few months later, our pipes got clogged, and we had to call a plumber. Fortunately, our service corps covered the bill, but the plumber discovered that the cause of the clog was pages torn from a book. This book was a gift from our service corps program, given to each of us when we moved in. It was about community organizing and redlining in Chicago. We learned about his unconventional use of the book when he came home. Noticed the plumber and casually mentioned, "It's probably because I've been using pages from that book to wipe myself." I then told our other roommate not to get upset about it. The situation was pretty shocking, and it was clear that his choice had led to the problem, despite our attempts to manage things more reasonably. Story 19. My dad usually kept his cool in public, but there was one memorable exception. During a family trip to Walmart when I was younger, we were driving out of the parking lot when another driver inserted us off. This driver then pulled up next to us and began shouting. My dad, also upset, started shouting back and told the other driver to pull over and settle things. The other driver did pull over, and my dad quickly parked our car and jumped out. We could tell a confrontation was coming, but the other driver wasn't ready for how things turned out. As the other driver began to get out of his car, my dad moved swiftly. Instead of giving the driver a fair chance, my dad closed the car door, which struck the driver's leg, and then reached in through the window to grab him. For the next minute or so, we watched through the car window as my dad continued to confront the driver. After that, my dad calmly got back into our car and we drove away. I've seen some people question my dad's actions, including comments about him being cheap or low class, which might be true in other contexts. But the key point is this. In that situation, my dad felt it was important to act quickly and take control. He didn't want to give the other driver an advantage by allowing him to get out of the car and prepare for a fight. Story 20. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, there's a fast food spot called Teriyaki Chicken Bowl. While it's not high-end dining, it offers a nice change from the usual burgers and tacos. One evening, I witnessed a rather unusual scene at this restaurant involving a grown woman having a severe tantrum. I arrived midway through the commotion, so I missed the initial disturbance, but the scene was striking. A woman who appeared to be in her 30s with curly brown hair stormed out of the restaurant holding a white plastic bag. A young man, fit and tall, followed her, trying to calm the situation. "No, I don't care," the woman yelled, clutching the bag tightly. The young man tried to ease the situation. "Don't do this here," he pleaded softly. "Don't cause a scene." The woman was having none of it. "Oh, I'm causing a scene? What about you? You're causing a scene. You didn't say anything, and now it's all ruined." "Can we talk about this in the car, please?" the man asked, his voice steady but urgent. The woman was clearly furious, her face flushed with anger. "I'm not going anywhere with you. I can't believe this. I can't believe this." I stayed in my car, waiting for the argument to settle down before going inside. This turned out to be a good decision, as the situation escalated quickly. The young man gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Look, let's just forget about it. We can stop for ice cream on the way home." The mention of the ice cream seemed to set her off even more. "Ice cream?" she screamed. "Ice cream? I don't want ice cream. I want a chicken bowl." In a dramatic gesture, she ripped apart the plastic bag, letting her meal fall into the pavement. The food, rice, and sauce-covered meat, spilled out. She then began to stomp on the food, grinding it into the floor while yelling, "Chicken bowl, chicken bowl, chicken bowl." Her tantrum went on for quite a while, with her making as much noise as she could. It was confusing to see her destroy the very thing she had been so persistent with. Eventually, she calmed down, or perhaps just ran out of steam and walked over to the young man's car. Before getting in, she gave the passenger side door a few frustrated kicks. I couldn't help but wonder why the young man tolerated such behavior. Story 21. I've got a memorable story from my days playing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Back when gladiator beasts were all the rage. At my local game store, when I played in casual tournaments, there was a judge we call Randy. Not his real name. Randy was a top-tier judge with extensive experience, having judged several big events and known for his deep knowledge of the game. Despite being in his 50s with silver hair and shaky hands, Randy was surprisingly notorious for fraud. People whispered about it, but it was hard to pin down because his dishonesty involved complex game mechanics that you usually trust an experienced judge to handle correctly. Then, one day I caught him in the act of something blatant and out of line. Since the casual tournaments didn't have a dedicated judge, I went to the store owner to sort it out. Randy completely lost his temper. Imagine your grandfather having a tantrum over some cards. His face turned red, and he started shouting, "Why are you talking to him?" Pointing at the store owner. "He's clueless. I'm the expert with all the accomplishments. I'm the only one you should trust for rulings. I say it's this way." It felt like I was about to witness a dramatic showdown. I was ready to protect my cards in case Randy went off the rails, as there were rumors he had flipped tables or even stolen cards before, though nothing was ever confirmed. The store owner, clearly displeased, told Randy to either correct his mistake and follow the rules or leave the store. Randy grudgingly complied, and I ended up winning the tournament. After that incident, I began to question whether I wanted to keep going to that store. By the third time, something similar happened. I decided to switch to Magic the Gathering. A judge known for fraud lost it when caught, nearly got banned from the store, and it led me to switch games. Story 22. Recently, I had an experience that, while not the most ridiculous ever, definitely ranks high on my list. A few days ago, I needed to adjust my watch band because my wrist hand was swollen from the weather and arthritis. While I was fiddling with it, a woman walked by and seemed intrigued by what I was doing. She stopped and stared closely, and then, out of nowhere, she began to berate me for having my watch band mounted the wrong way. I wore it with a buckle on the lower band, which seemed to outrage her to the point of yelling and getting quite animated. Normally, I can handle confrontations by facing the person and giving them a cold stare, but this was so surprising that I couldn't even respond. Just as I was trying to process what was happening, the cashier from the store, who was a small but fierce woman, stepped in. She grabbed the loud woman by her coat and calmly told her that if she didn't stop yelling and leave me alone, she'd be banned from the store for life. It was like flipping a switch. The loud woman immediately quieted down and stormed out in a huff. Thinking back on it, I'm tempted to move this incident into my top 5 most memorable moments. Story 23. Back in the mid-90s, I worked the morning shift at a 7-Eleven. I started my shift at 4:30 a.m., got everything set up, and we opened the doors at 5. Mornings were always hectic, especially between 6 and 9 when people came in for coffee and snacks. Customers could be rude and messy, treating the staff poorly, but one morning, a particularly memorable customer showed up. To give you some context, at this time our coffee bar had several pots with different levels of caffeine and flavors. We also had sweeteners and powdered creamer, but we never had actual milk. One day around 7 a.m., right in the middle of the morning rush, a man walked in. I knew he was from New Jersey because he mentioned it repeatedly. He bypassed the line and came straight to the counter to complain. He was agitated and told me that there was no milk at the coffee station. I finished up with the customer I was helping, apologized to the person behind him, and went over to the coffee bar. I pointed out the various containers of half and half and explained that's what we had. The man was clearly not satisfied. "I said milk!" he snapped. I apologized again and explained that we only had half and half and powdered creamer. I'd provided all the information I could, so I headed back to the register to help my coworker, who was swamped with customers. But the man wasn't done. He came up to the counter again, angry and red-faced. "You're going to get me some milk for this coffee," he demanded. "I'm sorry, sir," I said. "We don't have milk. What we have over there is all we offer." His face twisted in rage. "If you don't go over there and open one of those gallons of milk, I'm going to come across this counter. I'm from New Jersey." I'll admit, I was a bit scared. Fortunately, the manager came out of her office just then to deal with the situation. I'm not sure what ultimately happened to the man because the store was so busy, and honestly, I ended up quitting that week. No job, especially a convenience store job, was worth dealing with threats over something as simple as milk. Story 24. This happened recently, but it's definitely up there with some of the more severe experiences I've had. My dad had been complaining about the lack of food in the house, so I offered to go shopping for him and my mom. They've got busy schedules and I figured it would be a nice gesture. My parents own a business and sometimes use their business cards for personal expenses, which they manage well. However, they always keep receipts in case of audits, which happened once before. I went shopping with my dad's card and bought all the groceries they needed. I realized I'd forgotten lunch meat, so I had to make a second trip to get it, paying for it separately. When I got home, I accidentally put one receipt in the bag and left the other in my car. My dad asked where the receipts were. I handed him the one I had and told him I'd get the other one in a few minutes after unpacking. Apparently, this didn't go well with him. He immediately started yelling at me, calling me names and accusing me of trying to bribe him, despite the fact that I've always paid them back and never stole from them. He threatened to hide my car keys, which was a problem because I needed to leave for work in 20 minutes. In the heat of the moment, I grabbed my car keys and the missing receipt and gave them to him without saying a word. This made him even more upset. He started screaming, telling me I was disrespectful and to never ask for his help again. My mom, who witnessed the chaos, gave me a sympathetic look and handed me my brother's car keys so I could get to work. She gave me a, "I'm sorry, Dad's like this sometimes," look, which was pretty much all she could do. My brother and mom were very understanding and didn't mind me taking his car. My dad can be really unpredictable, and this was just one of those times when his reactions were out of the way. Story 25. I work in a mall and here are some of my crazy experiences. A customer with their first credit card was confused about why they needed to pay the credit card company even though they had paid us. They got very upset, accusing us of trying to double charge them. Another one was furious that we didn't have the Chrysler 300 they wanted. We explained that we don't rent that model due to high theft threat and that their reservation was for a Chrysler 200. He tried to fight my manager over it. In a separate incident, a customer crashed into a dumpster right after renting a car, causing $1,100 in damage. They were angry about the dumpster's presence and also upset when we wouldn't let them rent another car immediately. Additionally, a customer who didn't return the rented car had it reported stolen after 30 days. After being arrested, they called our risk management department, demanding we cover their legal fees. We had many customers demanding free rentals for reasons like a flat tire from hitting a curb, getting arrested due to an outstanding warrant, or even because the car wasn't fast enough for racing. Story 26. I worked at Starbucks for the better part of a decade. I've got 2 stories that stick out. We sometimes run these coupons called treat receipts. The gist is that you can get a drink later in the day for a discount if you bring back a receipt from earlier that day. We had this lady who would use the system, and every time we'd just give her the discount and say something like, "That's normally for 1 drink, but we will take care of it for you today." We did this probably 10 plus times for this lady, and she was always rude about it. So this lady rolls up and pulls the usual, and for whatever reason, the barista wasn't having it. Knowing we'd been over it before with her, the customer's response was to slap the drink out of the baristas and yell various obscenities. We tell her to leave, she leaves, and you'd think that's that, right? Nope. Turns out our employee was married to a police officer, so she filed a police report and they issued a warrant. The police picked her up a few weeks later as she was trying to get on a cruise. The total of money she would have saved if we let her use the coupon twice is 21 cents. A separate incident was a busy day and a barista was getting yelled at by a woman for not putting chocolate on top of a drink. I went over and said, "Oh, it doesn't normally come with chocolate, but I can put some on for you, no problem." This caused a man in the corner to come over and say, "Is there a problem here? Do you want to start something?" I said in disbelief, "Are you serious?" And he responded with, "You're right." The lady was yelling, "It's not worth it." And he responded, "I'm tired of people disrespecting you on your birthday." He then attempts to jump over the counter and she brings him out of the store. They then call the store phone to yell at and threaten me. He called security and they were escorted out. The first story was so fulfilling. Story 27. One day we had a substitute teacher in our class while we were working on an assignment. The task involved taking a picture of her work and uploading it to Google Classroom. One of my classmates tried to do this, but the substitute became concerned and attempted to take his phone away. We tried to explain that the instructions clearly stated we needed to upload the work. To clarify, I pulled up the instructions on the screen to show her. Unfortunately, this seemed to upset her, and she asked me to go to the principal's office. Instead of going straight away, I tried to explain that I was just trying to follow the instructions and help her understand the situation. Despite my attempts, she insisted that I leave, so I said, "All right, I'll go." I began packing my things. When I stepped outside, I was surprised to hear her on the phone with the principal, claiming that I was refusing to leave and she demanded prompt action from him. Given that the principal is known for being quick-tempered, I anticipated a tough encounter. I met him halfway and he started yelling at me about how I should never defy a teacher's authority. Having dealt with him before, I knew trying to reason wouldn't be productive. So I let him finish his outburst and simply responded, "Yes, sir." Once we were in his office and he had calmed down, I explained what had really happened. Despite my explanation, he concluded that I wouldn't be able to complete my work and might fall behind. His reasoning was that if he allowed me back in the classroom, it might seem like he was taking my side. Story 28. Back in 2015, I was working as a cashier at Walmart, specifically at the cig aisle. One day, a customer who looked like a slightly messy version of Christian Bale came in asking for a particular pack of cig. Unfortunately, we only had cartons of that brand in stock, and I had been instructed by my manager earlier that morning not to open cartons and sell individual packs. When I told the customer that we only had cartons and that I wasn't allowed to open them, he was not pleased. He asked why I couldn't just open a carton and sell him a pack. I explained that my manager had specifically told me not to do that. I offered to call my manager to see if we could find a solution, and the customer agreed to wait. He ended up standing there, determined to get a cig for nearly 20 minutes. During this time, my manager never showed up, and the customer grew increasingly frustrated. Eventually, he left annoyed, clearly upset. Shortly after, another manager passed by, and I mentioned the situation and asked about the policy on opening cartons. To my surprise, this manager said, "Oh no, you can totally open cartons." Story 29. I worked at Kmart for a couple of years, and during that time, I had an amazing manager named Ken. Ken was the kind of manager everyone wants. He listened to his employees, could joke around, but also knew how to be serious and get the job done. He was incredibly helpful and genuinely nice. One day, while I was assisting Ken at the customer service desk, an older, untidy-looking man walked in and asked to return a pair of boots. It was immediately clear that the boots were worn and in poor condition. Despite this, Ken, being the great manager he is, decided to process the refund if the man had his receipt. Unfortunately, the man didn't have a receipt and started yelling at Ken without any valid reason. Although I'm not someone who usually seeks confrontation, I was incredibly frustrated by the way the man was treating Ken over a pair of worn boots. It was upsetting to see someone act so furious over something so trivial. People can really be unreasonable sometimes. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. Catch you in that video.